right, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for coming to our webinar. Today we're talking about SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals and COVID-19, turning a global pandemic into a global opportunity. And we're gonna switch to the next slide. So we're gonna go over an overview basically of what we're doing today. The opening is talking about some rules, some tools that we're going to be using. I'm going to be giving a background as a scene setter to talk about how COVID has impacted SDGs. And then we're going to introduce our panelists. Really excited that they're all here. And then we're going to begin with our conversation. So let's start on to some reminders. So we will be using Mentimeter. We encourage people to pull it up on their phones. So if you can pull it up, it'll look like this. So www.menti.com, and then we'll give you a code and it'll allow you to have live interactions with us. So we encourage people to participate and take our polls and ask our questions. So ask questions throughout, send them into the chat, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as possible. And so that brings us to kind of why we're talking about Sustainable Development Goals and COVID. So as we have on the screen, these are our 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in July, the UN came out with basically their Sustainable Development Goal report for trying to achieve sustainable development, the 17 goals in the 15 years by 2030. And basically that report was kind of dismal. Like we were already off track, but they said when COVID hit, it created this huge crisis that is really unprecedented, ushering almost 71 million people back into poverty, mass unemployment, a lot of it, the brunt of it being taken on by women, and climate change obviously still happening. All the while, civil society groups have had mounting pressure to demonstrate why they're useful for society and why they're important to us. So coupled with that pressure and COVID-19, that's a lot of bad news. So some people are very concerned about how do we take this and turn it into an opportunity? And so that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. And we're going to break down our 17 Sustainable Development Goals into the economy, society, and biosphere. And we're going to look at it from those angles. So with that in mind, let's introduce our panelists. We're super excited to have Dr. Sarah Carty. She is the director of the Graduate Institute of International Development, Agriculture and Economics at the University of Reading in the UK. She is an interdisciplinary social scientist specializing in gender and development communication, and rural livelihoods. Currently, she is working with colleagues in Ethiopia, the Philippines, and the Sahel region, in Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya on projects looking at innovation systems in smallholder farming from a gendered perspective and on participatory communication, methodology and development, and context. Next up, hey Sarah. Next up, we have Deanna Rodriguez. She's a forest and climate change specialist from Colombia, currently a postgraduate student at the University of Reading. She has previously worked with a variety of civil society organizations, including working on forest and climate change with the FAO in Rome, sustainable forest management with the World Bank in Washington, DC, and land use for South Pole carbon at the World Bank. She supported the Rural Development and Agriculture Unit and the Natural Resources and Environment Unit on sustainable forest management projects in South America. Hello, Deanna. All right, and then we have Dave King.
Hello.
Hello. So we have Dave King. Dave founded Exaptive in 2011 to facilitate hypothesis generation and innovation using data. Frustrated, understandably, that discovery was often hindered by software and that discovery often hinged on serendipity, Dave was driven to build a software ecosystem that facilitates unexpected cross-disciplinary connections and yields more aha moments for everyone who needs to make better decisions from data. Dave spent 15 years working in software development, from system architect and large-scale database design to the psychology of user interfaces to managing software development teams. Hello, Dave, and thank you for being here. And that brings us to Jemiko Jamalong. He is the managing director of the Bamboo Company, a leading Filipino enterprise specializing in using bamboo as eco-friendly alternatives to everyday products. Previously a packaging executive for a multinational food manufacturing company, Jamika switched to social entrepreneurship to help reduce plastic waste and provide more options for an environmentally friendly lifestyle. During the pandemic, while other enterprises have closed down, the Bamboo Company adapted well and turned the pandemic as an opportunity to introduce PPEs made of bamboo. Hello, Jamiko.
Hello.
And finally, we have Michelle Zuckerman. She is the Director of Community Activation at EIT Climate Kick, a pan-European innovation and initiative for climate change. In this role, she works to bring unusual actors, communities, and voices not normally heard into action-based initiatives for climate. Previously, Michelle was the co-design lead and innovation architect for a whole of a system lab in the electricity sector in Australia. Over the last 15 years, she has worked extensively in complex innovation initiatives, exploring novel ways to tackle long-standing and systematic challenges. Hello, Michelle. And thank you for being here. Cool. So those are our panelists. Super excited you're all here. But enough of me talking. Let's get to our first question, which is actually for you guys, the audience. So this is one of those times when we are going to log into Mentimeter, pull it up, and we can type into the code 229424. So that is 229424. Submit. Yeah. And basically tell us which among the biosphere goals is most negatively affected by COVID-19. And I'm also going to pose this to our panelists, kind of get some information from you. If any of you want to jump in and you're like, I know exactly which biosphere goal I think we should be focusing on. Sarah, I feel like you definitely have an opinion on this.
Well, I can see the argument for both clean water and sanitation and climate action. I mean, clean water and sanitation is pretty fundamental if one is trying to protect yourself from COVID. And so not having access to clean water and sanitation is going to potentially have some pretty fundamentally negative effects on people. But at the same time, it could be possible that more effort is being put into making this possible, as we recognize the need to wash your hands and be careful. Attention could be pulled away from climate action, but at the same time, it could be put towards it. It's the climate action goals, and I suspect that Jamiko might have an idea on this, because I was thinking when I've gone out with reusable cups, some places are now refusing to take them. I'm seeing bin bags full of disposable masks. So thinking about the environmental impacts of even in the very small, even if just looking at what's happening around me, I would expect you take that to a global level, and that's potentially really negative. So yeah. I think it's going to cover a few of them.
Well, I definitely think you convinced at least one person. But overall, it's looking like it's climate actions. Jamiko, do you have anything you want to add to what Sarah was saying?
I think, just to add on this one, I think one of the things that we need to see as well is that climate action is being affected right now because there's no option. I mean, especially here in Southeast Asia. The problem that we encountered during the pandemic was that the only option that people have is the disposable ones, the disposable PPEs, the disposable utensils, and all those things. But then, whenever there's this another option that's very sustainable, people will shift their efforts towards that. And so that I think this one is we just need to offer as an alternative solution for us to be able to really see the impact for climate action.
And in your experience working with civil societies or like outside organizations, have they pushed for that?
Yes, basically for this one, like for example, the donations that during the pandemic, because Philippines is one of the most affected in terms of the number of active cases for COVID.
Hmm.
So during the time that there's this ramp up of cases, people are shifting towards non-reusable items, like the deliveries, all those single-use plastics, because they believe that COVID is being transferred towards the plastics. I mean,
Hmm.
towards the reusable ones. So
Yeah.
we just need to really inform the people that it's not. It's more on the information drive, and it's
Hmm.
more on an alternative, so that we could mitigate the impact on climate action.
Awesome. Good to know. Okay, well, I think you've convinced two people, but we're still seeing climate action as the number one. And that kind of sends us into our first real question for the panelists. So, what impact do you think COVID-19 has had on environmental and sustainability movements? And I know, Michelle, I know you probably have something to say on this.
Yeah, really excited to talk about this actually. And I stopped to think about how much time we're spending on Zoom and how much time we're kind of in these back-to-back meetings. And I was also thinking about, why do we do panels? Why is a panel a really good format for having a conversation about this? And where I landed and what I was thinking about is, this is exacerbated in the Zoom forum in the world we live in. The very, very best panels, I think, are where people offer personal opinions, where they say something a little bit provocative, or they give us a view or a perspective that we don't normally get to hear from. And so you did talk about this in your introduction of me. So I'm particularly interested in, who are the voices and what are some of the things inside of this climate conversation that we might be well placed to pay better attention to. So the first thing I did, being a good panelist, was I've slightly changed your question, if I may.
Yes, I'll accept that.
All good panelists do this. And I was thinking, what impact do we think COVID has had on these movements? And I think there's a lot of literature about this. There's a lot of studies. I think many of my co-panelists will actually be able to talk to this really, really well. But I think that the audience may also know some of these answers. They've probably read those reports. And so I thought, what if we flipped it a little bit, and what if impact wasn't actually the correct question? What if we said, what is it that COVID is teaching us about these movements? And what if we started to think about, inside of COVID, what are the movements we're seeing, and how might we apply those to our environmental sustainability and climate change movements? And so what I hope to do today is kind of place COVID and these environmental movements side by side. Of course, they're not exactly the same, but there's a lot of really interesting parallels I think we can draw from. And so the first one is, we can't see COVID. We can't see climate change. And what that means for us as people is we have to intellectually make sense of it. So it's not something that we can kind of feel and touch. And that's particularly true if we extract it up into the global level. So we are in a global pandemic. That's very hard for us as humans to begin to understand. What does that actually mean? And when we think about climate change, it's a global catastrophe that's waiting to happen. And so we've got this very high level intellectual thing. And what we have, and the way we try and make sense of it, is statistics. So how many deaths, and if we think about COVID, it actually has a much more immediate impact than climate change. So we have this illness, we have death, we have loss of jobs. So we're seeing these things much more immediately than what we do in climate change. And yet we're still not necessarily able to fully comprehend it. So we have data, and we also have data on the environmental side. How much destruction is happening, what is happening to the environment, what's happening to us. So we have all of this in our space. And so what I'm interested in is, how have people responded to COVID at that human dynamics level? And so what we see, so if we think about how they responded, what made them care, how did they respond initially, and then how has that changed over time? So I'd ask all the people who are listening, if you think about the 2 to 3 months in which where you lived, it was the most intense. And this will slightly vary from country to country about when that hit. But we were fundamentally connected to this issue. So we felt it emotionally, we had a lot of respect, we had a lot of reverence. And what we're seeing already is that people are beginning to disconnect from this. And this is a big problem in the environmental movement. It's very easy to disconnect from it.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing in our system is we're having to put incentives or disincentives, so penalties for not wearing masks, rules, lots of enforcement. We're already seeing this in the COVID space. And so that leads me to think one of the key lessons of all of this is, for the environmental movement, is that it's very difficult to hold space for this. It's very difficult to hold people's attention, particularly over the long term. So we've only really been in COVID for less than a year, and we're already getting some disassociation. So where that leads me to say is we need to radically rethink our current tools and methods for how we do this. And so what do I mean by that? I mean things like advocacy, education, awareness raising. They have been brilliant for both sides of this comparison I'm making, but they've also fundamentally left us not in a place where we can emotionally connect, and we're not able to stay there for the long term. And so that says, okay, these tools are great tools, they're great instruments, but how do we augment them? So how do we think about ways in which we can do this in a different way? It teaches me another lesson, which is if we do use tools like awareness raising or advocacy or education, and we learn from places like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, what we learn from this is these methods require endless investment. You have to endlessly invest in them. And the moment that Greta and these movements were not able to continue to invest, unfortunately, it kind of faded away for us in our consciousness. And so one last point I'll make, and then I'll flick it over to my co-panelists. The other thing I think we learned from COVID and the environmental movement is what happened for individual people when the world radically changed was they were sent into a space of introflexion. So they had to think, what is the meaning of my life? What is the meaning of what I want to do? What is the essence of all of these things? And what we had is people seeing for the first time that the world could be different. I'll take myself, I traveled every week for 15 years. And for 10 of those years, I wanted to not travel.
I can imagine.
And then COVID happened, and I was finally able to not travel, and I will never go back to that type of travel. And what it showed me is, as a person, I was valuing production, work, outputs more than my own personal well-being. We also saw this at other scales. We saw it at community scale. We saw wellness was being put in front of development. And at the highest level possible, we saw the world, for the first time in history, pick health over economy. And so what I say when I see this question is, how on earth do we learn from that? How did it become possible for us to choose health over economy for the first time? And can we expand the definition of health to not be one virus, but to be all of human health and all of life in general? And so there's three semi-answers to my questions, and I hope they are provocations. One is, what are the dynamics? Like, what happened in COVID that fundamentally changed us, and can we use that in the environmental movement? It's an emotional human change, and there's so many lessons to learn in that. Can we think about the instruments? I do believe in education, I do believe in awareness, I do believe in advocacy. Can we augment that with art, culture, emotions, and can we have them seen as the same level, because we need that type of engagement? And what on earth happened inside the decision-making powers that meant health was picked over economy? And can we understand those dynamics and use them as we go forward in the climate change movement?
Yes, I think those are all really great questions. Deanna, I know you probably have a lot to say on this too. If you want to follow up, maybe continue with those questions or go in with what your thoughts are.
And maybe I'll need to, please let me know if you can hear me well, because I'm having some problems with the audio. So if something, I turn off my video and hopefully it's better. Yeah, so I think this is a great moment for the sustainability movements and the environment. I was listening yesterday the speech that the president of the World Bank gave about the fast actions in the pandemic, and the World Bank focuses on four points. Mm-hmm. One of which is specifically facilitate the changes needed for inclusive and resilient economy. And in the resilient economy, he stressed basically how we need to turn into renewable energies. We have to stop with extractive industries depleting our natural resources. And I think that's the basis of the resilience that we really need to build, and that it actually gained a lot of protagonism during this time, because it's the resilience is what really will keep us alive, basically, right? Yeah. And to have this resilience, we cannot just exploit and just use all of our natural resources. We need to use them correctly, sustainably. We know this already from long ago. Mm-hmm. Since the climate change discussion started more than 15 years ago, resilience became quite important. Natural resources started to get protagonism, and right now, I mean, we experienced this. We were in our houses in lockdowns. We needed food, for example. I mean, this is basic needs to keep us alive. Where does food come from? From natural resources. We really need to focus on greener economies, and this is in the middle of this pandemic. Natural resources and sustainability are like the core, and they also have a good synergy with climate change. So we know activities that increase resilience are also activities that will help to reduce climate change impacts. So that's a great synergy in that sense. And I think we should, I mean, definitely, I work in a sustainability consultancy. We work a lot with private sector, and we have been super busy like this year. And that's great. I think the private sector is a big stakeholder, especially in developing countries, where now the governments are trying to cope with securing health and giving more social protection. And the private sector, it can give a lot of funding as well when they push for sustainable actions from, especially if I give you an example of what I work on in the food sector and along the supply chain. If they get more involved with the primary producers, the farmers that in developing countries also happen to be poor people in many cases, which are very vulnerable, which now with the pandemic, they even became like, we realize how the inequalities are and how they are more impacted with all of these situations. So if the private sector starts to engage and support from the roots, that would help increase resilience from these vulnerable people as well. And I think maybe I went to too many.
No,
I was a bit disorganized, but it's just it's such a complex topic.
It is.
It's interesting to try to connect everything. A bit complicated sometimes.
It definitely is a complex topic, but I think you touched on something Do you think it's the role, and this is for everyone, the role of civil societies to put more pressure on the private sector to bring about more change in the methods that they use, being more sustainable, being more climate conscious?
I mean, this, I'd like to chime in with a couple of thoughts that got generated by what Michelle and Dana were talking about. So, you know, one is I liked what Michelle did in sort of putting climate change and COVID sort of on equal, you know, next to each other as kind of models for us to think about ecosystems, is how I interpreted it. Like, you know, and I think there's this really good point that both of them have this aspect of things that are invisible that we're sort of learning how to, despite their invisibility, you know, take them seriously. I think that, you know, one of the things that COVID has done is it has actually made people much more aware. It's made it more visible of of how they are part of an ecosystem. In that, you know, part of the problem I think with climate change is we've created the perception of an ecosystem for ourselves, especially in developed nations, that all of your byproducts go one direction away. So, you know, your trash just goes away. It's a miracle. You know, your byproducts go away. It's a miracle. And your breath just goes away. You know, no one really thinks about where it goes. And with COVID, you know, what we've sort of learned is your breath doesn't go away. It goes to the next person. And if they're not wearing a mask, they get sick. And I think being able to see that ripple effect, as Michelle said, on a shorter time frame, be able to see that the actions that you take absolutely percolate not just through your home, your school, your community, but they percolate around the globe. That is sort of a feedback loop that I think has been sorely missing for people to just feel as experientially in order to as Michelle said, sort of connect with climate change. But the other piece I'd add to this, which goes back to your question about private industry, is I think that there's a flip side danger to this kind of now personal connection, which is that I think it is a mistake if the takeaway is that this is a personal problem that just requires personal agency. So like Michelle was saying, I mean, I regularly traveled over 100,000 you know, flight miles a year. My flight mileage this year is 0. So that is a tremendous decrease in my carbon footprint. And also for sort of all of the other executives I know, my entire team is not driving and commuting to work. Personal commuting has gone to near 0. And you know what? The level of climate effect is disappointingly low for all of those personal, for all the personal stopping that Michelle talked about. The effect, we've seen some of the effects like the smog over China, the beautiful radar images of the smog over China vanishing. But if you sort of look over the course of this year at the effect we've had on aggregate CO2 levels, it's not very much. And so what that I think suggests is this whole idea of carbon footprint and your personal carbon footprint is something that was really created by large organizations to get people to take personal responsibility for climate change. That really needs to be an organizational and public responsibility. And I think that, you know, likewise with COVID-19, we run the risk of saying it's everyone's personal responsibility to wear masks, but is it organizations' responsibilities to promote that inside workplaces and schools' responsibilities and government's responsibilities to send responsible messages about those roles? So I think, you know, there's an opportunity to use as a launching off point the sort of personal connectivity that Michelle was talking about, and to extend it, you know, to these larger organizations as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I feel like you were about to touch on circular economies, which we will get to, but there is a question from the audience. And I think, Jemiko, you might be able to handle this one. The audience asked, how do we change the perspective that reusables are not safe and hygienic, especially in the context of bring your own movements in regards to COVID? So I think maybe you touched on masks, so that brought everyone back to reusable stuff too.
Okay, basically, we need first to consider why is there this perspective that it's not safe or it's not hygienic. Sometimes what we have experienced is that sometimes we also need to know who is the stakeholders who benefits in terms of this dissemination of information. Because I mean, right now in this information age, there's a lot of information that is happening. I mean, like being disseminated across, and we need to filter out what are the informations very scientific based.
Yeah.
I mean, right now there's a lot of fake news that is happening, and one of the fake news that we have considered and seen is similar to this one, that there's a stakeholder that would benefit if there's this perspective that reusables are not hygienic. I mean, there's this manufacturers who would benefit getting orders from non-reusable ones. So it's really a matter, maybe for me, for what I've seen is it's matter of the stakeholders that's behind all the things that is happening across.
Yeah.
So we need to identify who are they, and we need to identify what are their benefits and maybe the not beneficial things that they will get from this. So what we just did is more on really generating information, good information and better information to the people, especially to the social organization across.
Hmm.
So it's just the perspective of the stakeholders really on
Yeah.
the behind the people behind all these things. So yeah, maybe the other panelists would have a other perspective on that one, but that's what we have seen
Okay.
during the pandemic.
Um, I think we're going to actually do one more audience question and then jump to a question for the audience. So the second question we've had from the audience, and I think, Sarah, you'll be really good at this. Don't you think the human population growth is one of the biggest threats to the ecosystem and to the desired quote unquote sustainability?
It's interesting because this comes up a lot. I was just watching a TV miniseries yesterday where the baddie had decided to release a virus because he felt that the world population was unsustainably growing, and therefore we needed to stop reproduction for 3 generations in order to kill off a bunch of the human population. And this is an argument that comes up a lot, and I've seen the debate about population growth, and the argument that overpopulation is the big problem. One of the things that I think is problematic about blaming overpopulation is partially people look at where populations are growing, and there's a certain ethnocentrism, and sometimes it's flat out racism. There are certain groups of people that some people in the world do not want more of, and that is racist. And so we need to recognize what are some of the really problematic roots of arguments about overpopulation. And fundamentally, I do think we need to look at our relationship with consumption. Where are resources being consumed? They are not being consumed by the large portion of the world. 80% of the resources in the world are being consumed by a small percentage of the population. It's wildly unequal. So that's where I think Michelle's reflection about the way our need to reflect in this reflection on our lifestyles, on what we need, and what we value. Think about this on an individual level. We've got a lot of stuff in some parts of the world. Some parts of the world don't. So there's a bit of that. There is, and I think there's a really good point that Jamiko brought up around where is the motivation for arguments about why the mythology that reusable products are more unsafe. There are mythologies that built up. There's not evidence. So If we look at evidence, we can see that's not true. We don't, and you can clean reusable items and you can make things hygienic and sanitary. So there's somebody's got an interest promoting those ideas. So if we look at who's being exploited and what are the impacts on who has access to what they need to live. I think that's more where we should be asking the question, because I don't think human population growth is one of the biggest threats. I think inequality, distribution of resources, ability to access what we need, and creating the circumstances in which people can make the choices that are best for themselves and their communities. When I've looked at resilience to climate disasters, the choices people were making that were not in their best interests were not really choices. They didn't have any other option. So when people have options and when people can interrogate and get access to the resources they need to implement these options, most people actually, I do fundamentally believe that human beings are not evil creatures. There are evil creatures amongst us, but I think that people are willing to act in the betterment of their community and the globe. We just, it needs a bit of work. And I think when Michelle was talking about communication, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to raise dialogue and to have discussions that we aren't using. I spend a lot of time looking at development communication. So my little development communication hat has been on looking at the different messages that have gone out, and my radar for how to make a lot of mistakes has also gone up. So there are a lot of things that we've undermined some really effective tools. And yet there's also a lot of things we already know work, but they're difficult and they require commitment. And those are things that people really struggle with. So, and some of it does mean we have to hold power to account, like big corporations, for example, that are using unsustainable amounts of resources. I'm thinking about Dave's comment about the impact of individual choices. We need to think about the impact of large scale choices as well. So I really get my back up a bit, actually, a bit at blaming human population growth, because where are the populations growing? It's that we have to be very, very careful about.
And I think that's a good jumping off point to our next question for the audience, which brings us to our society section. So Ryan, if you would, yes, perfect. We're going to go back to Menti. Oh, I see people have already started their polls, started participating. So the question is, which among the society goals is most negatively affected by COVID-19? And if you go to menti.com and use the code 2294204, that'll give you access to this question. And so far, immediately, we're looking at SDG number 1, no poverty. But we do see gender equality. And we did have a question from the audience about gender equality as well. Does anyone want to have from the panelists a brief chime in on this?
Nora, it's been really interesting. There has been a rise in some places of domestic violence and gender-based violence because people are locked down or restricted. So I've been seeing a lot more, for instance, in the UK, there's been a few agencies that are providing free train tickets if you need to get out of a situation of domestic violence. But I do think COVID has exacerbated that. And I haven't seen enough attention paid to things like, what about access to sanitary supplies for people who, they're very expensive anyway. And now people are getting less and less access to things like that. So that comment has wildly, the comment about exposing women, girls, and children and girls and homeless, some places seem to have had a good short-term solution, but then, and we've demonstrated that we can deal with finding homes for everybody, but then they get turfed out back on the street once it stops being politically expedient.
Yeah.
So that is, I think we need to really rethink that. That's been a really difficult one to watch, because it's like, actually, let's think about this.
Yeah. That's a good answer. I mean, so far though, substantially, people are very concerned about no poverty, and I think that is kind of what plays a lot in the news, especially in the United States. So let's kind of go to our next question for our panelists, because that one is more about the economy. And so the short of it is, how will development actors ensure social protections of vulnerable groups in the short term while balancing the long-term issue of poverty? And I believe, Jimiko, you have some information or some thoughts on this. And we'll yeah, stop at the screen share. There we go.
Yeah. So basically for this one, we need to identify what's really the need of the sector of this one. Because like for example, for our case, um, one of the issues that COVID highlighted, I don't know if this is more on the developing countries, but it's more on the issue of um, education. Because the COVID situation shifted the issue towards going at home, and not all not all people, specifically here in the Philippines, have an access to internet, which is the main right now. It's the main platform for education. So that's one thing that we need to identify, that there's this underlying issues that would really further create this destructive cycle. Like earlier, the one highlighted is more in poverty, but there's this issue that it's not yet an issue as of the moment, which is the education, but it's an issue that would enable the destructive cycle towards poverty. And this is the things that we need to answer, especially for us, for the government, for private institution, for the development sectors, that they need to see other things that would create problems in the future. So that's one of the things that we need to identify in this issue of the COVID situation.
Okay, yeah, that's really good.
I think that Sarah's point about consumption also really ties into these issues of economy and of poverty. Specifically, her point about inequity and the fact that resources are not distributed evenly. So the economic impact has been profound with COVID, and that is actually driving a lot of the decisions that are being made. And the challenge with that is sort of unpacking what are actually, I think, complex and competing economic incentives, all wrapped up in the sort of overarching idea of economic impact. So what I mean by that is part of the messaging that's driving, as Sarah was talking about, the messaging that drives the mythology that reusable is not as good, is profit motives from organizations that stand to benefit from selling single-use items. And so there's two, I think, issues around economic impact. There's trying to understand how to get workers who need to have living wages and need to put food on the table, to understand how the pandemic is affecting them, and to rightly make sure that everybody in the world can support themselves through a difficult time. That is different than thinking about how organizations continue to support their kind of original growth forecasts to meet stakeholder expectations. Those are two very different profit motivations. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to say that one is all good and one is all bad. I mean, there's certain organizations that we want to survive in the world just as much as we want all the people to survive. But what I mean is they're different economic motivators. And right now I see them kind of entangled very much as one thing. And I think that the personal economic impacts also can't be decoupled from some of the planetary impacts. You know, one of the other things that came up in the first question was water and sanitation. Water and sanitation affects poor, vulnerable populations. And if people don't have the resources to live in the places with water and sanitation, then you're going to put an increased burden on that. So there's an economic component to this, but I think it does, I think the opportunity in COVID, because I do want to focus on the panel in terms of trying to opportunity, you know, I do think the opportunity is that we're taking a pause to reflect on what happens when we stop certain things. And I think, you know, to Michelle's point, it's not all bad to have that kind of stopping. I think, you know, as populated as the world is, to Sarah's point, when some things stopped, some aspects of the world healed with the existing population count. That's good for us to see. So now I think what that pause can do is it can shift the conversation to say, why can't we take a slightly different view of consumption, regardless of the pandemic? And I think that's a really healthy conversation for us to have.
Yeah, I think that's a great jumping off point. If anyone wants to add on to that, kind of what are the roles in this opportunity there, in this space that civil societies can fill? Like, should they be more advocating for kind of a different view of an economic situation, like a triple bottom line, or should they be directly focusing on like governmental changes or other suggestions? I know that's also a really big question too. So,
well, Nora, one of the things that I've seen come up, and that's been really interesting and kind of energizing for me, is there's been a number of, a lot more emphasis on local instead of looking all over the world. Also looking in our backyards and supporting local businesses and local producers. That's been really interesting, how I've seen a big rush and much more emphasis on this coming up here in the UK in the last few months. And it's one of those things I'd like to see, I hope, continues to grow. And there's also been a lot of organic, so there's this artist support challenge that emerged on Instagram, because a lot of artists use fairs and public events to sell their work. Well, everything's getting canceled. So someone took it on themselves to start an artist support challenge where an artist agrees to sell, an artist takes a picture or puts an image up of their work on Instagram and sells it for no more than, I think, like a $200 or a pound or the equivalent per piece. And then once they've sold $1,000 or £1,000 worth of work, they promise to spend 200 on someone else's work. And I started by one person, and I've seen versions in 5 different countries now, as well as the global one, where people are looking at supporting smaller enterprise and individual businesses. And that has been, and it's been easier to access smaller places that weren't as accessible before. So there's an opportunity there to keep our eyes peeled and keep looking at what are some of the independent, what are people in our community doing, and how can we keep supporting that?
I think that's a great example of taking what could be seen as a negative, a gap, and finding an opportunity in it.
Could I build? Oh, sorry, Nora. Could I build from Sarah's comment? I really loved it. And when we think about this, so you use the word advocacy as well. So is there now a place for civil society to be advocating for change? And I think what Sarah showed, and there are literally thousands and thousands of these examples, what she showed is it's actually a new power. So it's not requiring people to advocate up. And it's some of it is grassroots, but what we're seeing is there's this new power in the middle in communities, in people taking action, in being able to aggregate for themselves. And that's a fundamental disruptor. And so I think I would echo everything that Sarah said, but just encourage us to keep thinking that this is about changing, and we have the opportunity to change structures. So if things like our financial structures or capitalism or the way, all of those things, when we think about governance structures, if they are part of what got us into this predicament, we saw that as COVID came, there were lots of failures in all of those systems.
Yes.
Can we encourage ourselves to, when we see good examples, not kind of default to those examples being, oh yeah, that's a great example of, oh yeah, they did this nice thing over here. No, that could in fact be the new way that we go about existing in the world. And so that's the opportunity that I see. It is a shift to local, it is a shift to community, it is a shift to power. It's that's where I think it's exciting for me, and why I led all of that human dimension at the beginning.
No, I think that's great. And I think that actually kind of brings us nicely into our next question for the audience. So we're shifting to local and we're shifting to more communities and shifting in power, but we've been talking about economies as well. And so once again, audience members, this is for you. Get on to Menti, type in the code 4063880, 4063880. You might have to refresh. And we're looking at which among the economy goals do you think is most negatively affected by COVID? So we'll give people some time to do that. Anyone on the panel want to take a quick stab at this? If they're like SDG number 9 or number 10?
Well, I'm going to take a play from Michelle and change the question here. People are answering which are most negatively affected. I'm going to look on the bright side for a second. And I think that SDG 9, which includes innovation, industry innovation, and infrastructure, I think has the opportunity to come out positively affected for the reasons that many of the panelists have talked about, which is, by and large, no one changes when they're comfortable, and things don't change when they're comfortable. And innovation is inherently about changing the status quo, which is hard to do when the status quo is comfortable. And I think that we have an opportunity now in this discomfort to change some of the infrastructure that affects industry and that affects innovation. And I really, and part of the reason I was, excited about being on this panel and part of these conversations kind of from the private sector is that I don't want that opportunity to be lost. And I don't think it will just happen automatically unless people are really good stewards of the opportunity that's been given us here.
I think that was really well put. And I think that plays into people's concerns over SDG number 10, which is reduced inequalities. I think people are feeling like we're seeing more inequalities happening. So that brings us to our next question for the panelists. So there's been some progress in the past in pushing for a circular economy in different industries, e.g. food production, packaging, fashion, etc. How has COVID affected this progress? And with the rethinking and learning from the experiences with the pandemic, do you think that the push for a circular economy will accelerate? Why or why not? Yes, so how has COVID affected the progress in pushing for a circular economy? Dave, I know you want to talk on this.
Well, I mean, so I mentioned this a little bit in an earlier comment, as you alluded to, that I think, a lot of our models have not been circular. They've been very much the idea that things come to me and things move away from me. And I think that what's tricky about it's sort of well and good, I think, to stand by my higher level comment. Okay, we now see we're part of a bigger ecosystem, we get a shorter feedback cycle. But if I were to sort of nitpick at my own answer, I'd say, but so what? How does that actually translate into some change? How does that lead to different policies or different actions that are actually going to change some of the mythology that Sarah was talking about and replace it with something else? So I think there's an answer to that, which is, I think that part of what needs to be done to make a circular economy really work is to be able to see how individual contributions in a larger chain add value, and not to simply assign value at the sort of end of the chain. And I think that this sort of shift in how we measure value becomes important, because that also opens the doors to changing the way that we distribute value. And so this would be, you know, a couple musings I have on this topic, and I'd be curious to see what other panelists think on this as well.
Yeah, Jemiko, I know you also have some experience in this.
Just to add to what Dave said, right now as well, we also need to see that people right now is seeing that there's the disconnection between economic growth and sustainability. That they're trying to like have it as a black and white option.
Mm-hmm.
That you cannot grow without having the sustainable part of it. Given that we're already on a 21st century, we're already somewhat developed. We need to tell people, specifically maybe the government and the private parties, that you could craft something that could create economic growth while being sustainable. I mean, just recently I've seen that there's this clean tech company that already have that market cap as compared to ExxonMobil, which I mean, that comparison of having this carbon emission company as compared to this green company. So it's really trying to tell people, or having that change in mindset, that we could have that economic growth while at the same time ensuring that there's a sustainability that's in place. Because right now it's really people are really trying to have it as black and white. So yeah.
Deanna, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I think this, I'm sorry, I'm keeping my video off because I'm having problems with the audio. So I think it links a bit with what I said before, that there is a need now of basically not depleting the natural resources, and this is where the circular economy is important, and it has been already for some years now taking more and more importance, but I think that with the pandemic now it's totally an opportunity for it to expand and gain protagonism. I mean, even, and I'm coming back to the food examples because this is my area. And if you think about it, like almost 1/3 of the food that is produced is lost or wasted on the way. And so there is a huge opportunity to be more efficient in the use of natural resources. And this will be just like beneficial for climate change. I mean, the resilience, what we have been talking about. And I do think there is an important, then this is just to link with what the other panelists have been discussing, is I do think that this civil society and each one of us should be more aware, but also we need from the developed country point of view, sometimes it's forgotten how developing countries, the logic that and the dynamics in the developing countries, because some people there are aware of that we need to take care of the natural resources, we need to be more sustainable, but then you go into a shop and you find a sustainably produced product that is 2 times more expensive than the other non-sustainable produced product. So people in developing countries would go naturally for the cheaper price. So in here, there is a need to for the government to give more incentives, or well, policymakers, but just to keep in mind that there are other realities that is not only, and it's great that is a growing awareness towards this, but that's not the main decision, the main element to make a decision towards sustainability, especially in developing countries.
Yeah.
And I have one other thought on this in the context of the circular economy, and I'm gonna, like Michelle said, maybe the job is to provoke a little bit. I'm gonna put an idea out there, and I'll be interested to see what other people think of it. And I'm not an expert on the circular economy, but my understanding of it, it seems to very much focus on resources. So it's very much trying to move away from, make waste to sort of a better use of resources. It talks about sustainability, which has implications for the planet. What feels like it's missing to me in that, which is of course there implicitly, but I sort of wish it was more explicit, is the people. And I don't mean people just as resources. I don't mean people just, as one link in the chain of production. So what I think's interesting with COVID, connecting this with COVID, is that COVID is very much about people. Like that's where we're experiencing it first and foremost, is with death and with pain and with loss. And what I sort of wonder is whether there's an opportunity to be able to use the concepts of circularity, which is really about sort of interconnectedness, and apply those not just to the perspective of resources, but to the perspective of people. And, I saw a comment about, someone in their country where resources are low and hospitals have collapsed and there's a large number of deaths. What I'd like to see is a circular perspective in which we understand that that's not just that person's loss, that country's loss, but that's a loss for us because we're in a circle with what those people do and what those, those people's lives and those countries' actions. And I think that, the circular economy has worked hard to generate flowcharts that show how things are interconnected from a consumption perspective. I would love to see COVID allow us to generate the sort of that same sort of circular flowchart from a human perspective. It feels missing.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a really great point that you're touching on. It's to circular economies and circular access with people kind of needs a systems change and a systems thinking change. And that's what COVID really has brought about in this great pause. I think that Michelle really hit home on. And I'm loving this. And I think we're having a great conversation about it, and we can go on for more, but I think we're going to go on to our final question, because I think that's really where this is ultimately getting us to. So it's going to start really with, to the audience. This is our last Menti thing. Please participate. This is really for you to think about. So go to menti.com, type in the code 4063880, and in your own words, just type out post-COVID-19 as a development actor. What will be your role in ensuring the achievement of SDGs? After listening to this, what do you think your opportunities are as a person? Like what can you do, I think, on a micro level, an individual level, and on a macro level? So as a member of a civil society, or as a person just functioning within a society. So type those out. And I think while we see those come up, if anyone from the panel kind of wants to maybe give their thoughts.
As a quick reflection, I think post-COVID-19 is too late. It's this idea that it may be over, but actually maybe it isn't over. And so I've talked about a great pause, but it is actually just a great reshuffle. It's a pause, but it's just fundamentally different. And I think we do have this narrative where we think things might go back to normal. And so I would encourage us, as we're thinking as development actors, it has to be as part of our recovery, it has to be as part of, am I still here? I feel like it's paused. Oh yeah, good.
Yeah,
Okay,
no, you're
sorry,
still
it all
there.
just went super still.
We're all
It
just
has to be-
enthralled.
That's good. Yeah, I'll just conclude it there. It has to be as part of our transition, not some kind of futuristic point where we're aiming to, that frankly we'll never get to if we don't build now.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think you already have a fan in the comments. As Michelle said, CSOs have a newfound power and can mobilize this for policy changes. Yeah, I think that's true. I think we really talked about this is an opportunity to highlight how civil societies can play a role in advocacy, in making changes, in highlighting different ways of systems thinking. So we're going to let the audience continue to think about it. We might come back to this screen to see more answers, but we're going to go to our final question for the panelists. And this, I think this is a good question. It kind of highlights what we're all here for. So to start with, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said, in reference to COVID, we need to turn the recovery into a real opportunity to do things right for the future. What do you see as opportunities from this time period that will allow for a more sustainable future? Post-COVID, as a development actor, what will be your role in ensuring the achievement of SDGs? And I know Dave is going to kick it off and probably change the end of that question to, something.
I mean, I like this question. I think this is a good question, and I think that you know, there are a couple points to maybe reiterate from the conversation. I think the main one is not to see our role in this disaster, not to see our role as one of just getting back to where we were before. Now, there are certain aspects, don't get me wrong, like I would like to get back to lower mortality. I would like to get back to certain economic, I'm not trying to be dismissive of that at all. But as I think Michelle mentioned, the idea that we're just going to get over this and get back to the previous status quo, I think would be a missed opportunity. And so in terms of what one thing development actors can do is basically demand that this is a catalyst for a different status quo on the other side. And I'll give an example. You know, I'm an engineer in the tech space, so I'll give a kind of tech example, which might seem funny at first, but I think there's a value in the analogy. One of my personal mentors and one of the advisors to my company was one of the early implementers of computerized stock trading in the 1980s. And you know, he built with a team, he built an amazing system. It was the first computer to ever be able to trade a stock, and no one wanted to use it because that wasn't how stocks were traded. And so that was a little frustrating. So they built their company and it was just sort of going along, but it didn't really look like it was going to take off. And then there was the stock market crash of 1987. And in the stock market crash in 1987, predominantly the way that stocks were traded were through the phone system. And the crash just overloaded the phone systems, and brokers, basic exchanges, took the phones off the hook if the infrastructure wasn't actually taken down entirely. There was some paper trading, there was other sort of backup systems, they all failed. And in the panic that ensued, people said, maybe we should try this computerized stock trading system. And it worked. And, you know, it was after the crash, a significant number of stock traders said, maybe we won't go back to the paper-based, phone-based systems. Let's keep using the stock trading things. You know, today, telling this story sounds funny. I mean, we probably can't imagine stock trading happening, you know, without computers. But it was a crash. It was a sort of, you know, disaster that led for people to change that. So, you know, and his quote about this, which I really liked, is he said, you know, the stock market crash could have kind of threw all the pieces of the puzzle up in the air. And when they landed, they didn't land back in the same configuration. And I just really thought there was something beautiful about that visual. So I think, you know, to Michelle's point, we're in it right now. The pieces are up in the air. And I don't think we should sort of think about our role after they land. I think we can think about our role now as starting to push them into the configurations, into some new configurations. And one very tangible example of that, I think, that I have high hopes for, because I'm very interested in collaboration and team building and things like this, is that the shutdown of our physical cities in lockdown in a lot of ways, and the movement to virtual interaction, has actually really democratized thought partnership across the world in a lot of ways. It is now just as easy for me to have a conversation with all of you as it is to have a conversation with my team that works within a 10-mile radius. Or I should say another way, it's actually just as hard for me to have a conversation with my team that works in a 10-mile radius as it is to have a conversation with people around the world. But I chose to say it's just as easy because that's the point. I think that this has created an opportunity where the playing field has been leveled in terms of who you can work with and who you can talk to. And I think that's not just at an individual level, is that we've also seen governments having to work together, medical institutions working together, pharmaceutical companies that tend to be very proprietary having to work together. But this is not utopian. We've also seen nationalism and proprietary, withholding of information. So I think this is where I'm particularly interested in focusing some attention, is the fact that this has leveled certain aspects of the playing field. How do we try and keep the playing field level? How do we learn about models of collaboration and collaborative development that span private, public partnerships, also span national divides? And that, I think, is a very big opportunity that we have to make sure we make the most of.
Well said. Sarah, it looks like you want to add to that.
Well, I agree and I disagree.
Mm-hmm.
It has been a lot easier to connect with some people. And you nuanced what you were saying, Dave. In some ways, it's also made it very, very clear where there are inequalities that nobody was willing to recognize. I can't do a video call with some colleagues that I work with in a certain part of the Philippines because they don't have strong enough internet. There's many places where I was on a call earlier today and we were trying to connect with a colleague in North Africa and it just wasn't working. And there's not really there's not enough infrastructure, but there's also not a lot of excuses. And sometimes it has been difficult in the past. I've had people say, well, why can't you just video call them instead of going and talking to them in person? Well, because you can't. I mean, getting there in person is a bit of a faff too, because there's not really a road. Or you have only a road to go vast distances. So I think we can't ignore it anymore. Some of this is because physically it's difficult to get masts up a mountain, for example, but where it is simply because there's been no will, that's not okay anymore. And it wasn't ever okay in the first place, but you can't ignore it. There's never been enough support and services for women experiencing domestic violence and children experiencing gender-based violence. It's just now slapping us across the face a bit more. Inequalities, we can't ignore the gaps we're seeing in health infrastructure. There was even one of the comments is about food wastage because farmers weren't able to get to harvest the crops and get them to market. That's a failure and a gap in the food system. So we can see housing crises coming. Well, that's because there's a problem with the housing systems. So in some ways it's given us sort of incontrovertible evidence, but we need to remind people, we need to remind policy that there is, that this exists and not let them forget it come the next election. or saying, forget it, come post-COVID. We have to say, no, this is not something we're willing to live with as global societies anymore. And at the same time, there's also examples. We get a lot of bad news, and I'm really finding the good news quite fascinating. I got a little flyer through my letterbox from one of my neighbors who had clearly written up a little flyer for everybody in a several block radius saying, if you're self-isolating and can't go to the grocery store, send me a text on this number and I'll go get anything you need. Our neighborhood wasn't unique in that. There are stories all over the UK, for instance, of 17-year-olds and young people who said, my immunity is a bit better than yours. Do you want me to go out and get you things? Colleagues, and I spent a lot of time with the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and I've got stories that they've got. The College of Development Communication has been collecting food, has been collecting donations and giving them to communities that are more vulnerable. There are companies that like there's one called Cereza, and they buy all of their food and goods from indigenous farmers, and they're now using this space and people buying online to connect more farmers and people paying fair trade prices and proper food prices to indigenous farmers. So where there's been a lack of market linkages, people have been able to get those market linkages. So there are a lot of really good news stories about communities supporting one another. And that's sort of, how can we keep doing that? My fear is that we won't, but at the same time, communities are resilient and people are resilient. So if we support our continued resilience and support and celebrate the people who are doing these things and keep putting our money where our mouths are, and putting support into that in a whole range of ways. It doesn't have to be financial. It could be reposting a Black-owned business on Instagram, sharing a community-based organization's information with everybody that you know. There's a lot of different ways to just be supportive and advocates. And I think that's a very specific thing that I think we need to keep in mind and promote.
Yeah, I think this is all really interesting. And it's brought this question to my mind, in that I think COVID, we've had this emotional attachment to COVID, and it's there, but it's kind of fleeting. But it's highlighted the inequalities and the gaps within our systems, and it has allowed us to have more emotional ties to those gaps. So we're very passionate about changing these systems now. Is this then the space that civil societies should be working in, should be taking advantage of the opportunity to keep that momentum going?
I mean, I think that there's a point here that feels to me really connected, which comes back to communication. Because when you talk about how do you keep the momentum going, when when Sarah talks about the fear that I share, that this has kind of illuminated gaps, but what happens if that flashlight turns off? Do we forget that those gaps are still there? I think this is an important role for communication. And I think one thing that COVID has illuminated as a gap is how bad we are at communicating.
Sarah definitely agrees.
Communicating on polarizing issues in which there's an aspect of scientific, factual dimension and cultural, ideological dimensions. We're very bad at integrating those two. And so we create a spectrum that says you either need to choose your cultural or ideological beliefs, or you need to choose science or facts. They're not always science facts, they're fact. We say this is fact, you should listen, or this is a belief framework you should follow. And no one, in my experience, no one makes good decisions when they're kind of pinned against two diametrically opposed options. This is a completely false dichotomy, which is the communication should be centered around how you use the facts and the science to make the best informed decisions that integrate with your personal beliefs and comfort level and culture and ideology. And we're just not good at that. And I think we also have a mistaken belief that people make decisions based on information. They don't. They make decisions based on the messengers of the information and the relationships they have with that information and the messengers. And so we don't have a relational view of knowledge transfer. We have a kind of fact-based view of knowledge transfer. And what we've seen in climate change for years is it doesn't work. And what we see now in COVID is it really doesn't work on a faster time scale. And that just, if we can address that, if we can figure out a different way to talk to each other so that other people listen and act in ways that are aligned with fact-based objectives, but also aligned with individual agency and belief systems, that positions us not just for climate change and COVID, it positions us for the next crisis we don't know is coming yet that we need to be prepared for. So anyway, that's, sorry, a bit of a soapbox on that, but I just think this is a critical issue. I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, no, I loved it. But Jamiko, oh, sorry, Sarah. Let's go to Jamiko because we haven't heard from him, and then Deanna, and then we'll pop back up to Sarah, and then finish off with Michelle.
Super.
Okay. So I think one of the things that development actors would need to do is really to facilitate the voicing of the people towards the different actions and different choices that we are creating. Because COVID really highlights the issues and gaps, the systems we have right now. So right now, it also highlights how the voice of the people and the choices of people creates the impact and the results we would like. I mean, as Sarah told earlier, I mean, amongst the examples, that people have this choice and have this voice to create impact. And that's something that development actors needs to facilitate towards a better future. And that's something that we also would need to identify and to realize that every one of us has this voice and has this basically this choice to create a better normal post-COVID.
Nice. Deanna, do you have anything to add? We're coming up to the end of our time, so everyone has to be brief. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. No, thanks. I mean, I'm sorry I lost the last 10 minutes because really my audio was terrible, but I just wanted to thank you all the panelists and you for the invitation. It was a really nice discussion. I think we all are aware that we can make, each one of us can make our part on this. But of course, I do think that there is also a big push to be done by governments and the private sector. So at the end, we all need to work together. I know that individually it may feel that the change is not much, but I think that at least we do our part, and that's a contribution already, and try to also influence and work all together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna. Sarah?
I mean, I agree with Dave's soapbox. And I have to laugh because this is something I've been working in communication for a long time. And we need to remember that the medium is the message. Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, and that's often something we forget, and yet, boy, does that smack us in the face a lot. And there's a lot of ways we're not particularly good at dialogue because dialogue is difficult. It means we have to listen, probably more than we talk, but listening and understanding. It is about human. I like the idea of a human circular economy because we are globally connected. We can have, I mean, here we've got people in a range of different countries and we have a lot in common. So it is uncomfortable to live with the fact that the world is a whole lot of shades of gray and purple and all the different colors. And by essentializing things to me yelling at you and you yelling at me, we're gonna get nowhere. And and so I agree, we've got to stop the fractiousness and take the opportunity to listen and to engage with each other. So saying buy local doesn't mean ignore the global. It doesn't mean not paying attention to all our neighbors. I realized the other day, my local is very global, and that community probably covers a good 15 countries, and that's something to celebrate. So celebrate these human connections that we've got and remember how to support them and take care of each other. So being listening, think about empathy. For one another more, because we haven't talked about the mental health side of the crisis, but there's been
we don't have time.
So fundamentally, if we are just try to be slightly nicer to each other on a very bare minimum, let's not be jerks.
Fair enough. Michelle, closing comments.
Closing comments. We've asked a lot in this session, what should civil societies do? And I would love us to reframe our thinking. So as actors in this space, or if we're talking about social development or people, us as actors, we have to fundamentally change that. So civil societies, if we take it to the word communities, they come together because they want to. That's a real community. The lady put the things, or the person put the things in the letterbox because they wanted to. And so you can't control that. And so what I would encourage us to do as actors in this space is recognize we can't control it. And if you do that, if you let go of control and you trust that communities can look after this without being told what to do, you get into a fundamentally different place. And I know we've got only a couple of minutes, so I would encourage you to look at the city of Bologna. They have done some wonderful, wonderful work in this space. There was one group, one community of people who wanted to paint a park bench. That's why they came together. And the city realized they had no procurement, no legal, no insurance. There was no way for these people to paint the park bench where the city could be involved. And if you fast forward 20 years later, they have a ministry for civic imagination. They have deferred all of their power making, their decision making to their community. And so that's what I encourage us to do. Yeah. We are the actors and the leaders in this space, and there are plenty of places that do it. So change our thinking and give up control.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much sums up what we've gone over. So thank you for doing my job at the end. That sums up kind of what we've been talking about in this whole webinar as civil societies and as individual development actors. You know, let communities take control. Think about how we can advocate with our newfound power as civil societies to advocate for system changes, and thinking on a human level, on an emotional level, to have, I think as Dave put really well, we all liked the idea of a people circular economy, and how we can continue this momentum and make sure that as we reconstruct a new normal post-COVID, so it's a more inclusive, more with less inequality and more of a focus on betterment for all type of world. And I think that's really where all of us feel civil societies can play have a space and play a huge role. And then yeah, that's really where I think we're going to end. So I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience for coming. If you have any last minute questions, you have about 2 minutes before this is timed off. But yeah, this has been a great conversation. So that's the sum of it. If anyone wants to just now talk while we delay our 2 minutes, go for it.
Well, thank you for organizing this, Nora. You've done a really good job as a panel tamer.
It was you guys. I mostly just was like, yes.
You've done a really good job. So thank you very much for your fantastic skills.
Thanks everyone.
And to the other panelists. I learned a lot from each of you, so thank you. It was really nice.
The same, and I think I would say, you know, in the spirit of human circular economy, if people in the audience who, you know, I can't even see their faces, I don't know who they are, I don't know what thoughts it's generating. If there's anything from this panel that actually generated thoughts for you and you take any action as a result of them, try and figure out how to close that feedback loop. I would love to know that, and maybe that can start to show the closed loop of these ideas.
Yes, and I think you're all on LinkedIn too. So I know I am. So anyone can reach out to me. But definitely, it seems like reach out to Dave if you've made some initiatives because of this panel. And if you end up with T-shirts that say "Human Circular Economy," we'd love them.
But get them printed on bamboo fabric that you get from Jamico.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So I think with the remaining time, Ryan, can you pull up actually the screen to see if we have any more comments from the audience? Oh, we're at time. Never mind. Look at that. So once again, thank you. And now we're just going to awkwardly wait for our live stream to turn off because I've just been informed we're at time.
Thank you.